Trying to put this someplace where it's not in the way. Right. Well, welcome everybody. We are going to take a look at Ezra and Nehemiah over the next couple of weeks together. And in order to do that tonight, we are not going to look at Ezra and Nehemiah at all. What I want to do tonight is I want to give you a kind of a timeline of the Old Testament. Because sometimes what we don't take time to realize is that like Noah and Moses and Abraham and Jeremiah, none of those people ever met each other. I mean, sometimes we get the idea, like in American history, that there was one time a meeting where Abraham Lincoln and George Washington sat down. That never happened. I mean, those two guys were lots of years apart. And sometimes we don't realize exactly how far apart some of the events of the Old Testament are. So that's what I want to do. Is I want to put it in context of the Old Testament, kind of help you see where it goes. But one of the things that we're going to find out over these weeks that we're going to be studying these books together is the big thing that was really important to Ezra especially, but it was also very important to Nehemiah, was the fact that they were preserving something. There was something that was important to them that they wanted to preserve. So what they did is they made sure people knew about it. When Nehemiah says, hey, we're going to build this wall, he made sure everybody understood why. When Ezra said, hey, we're going to resurrect some of these old traditions we used to have, he made sure everybody knew why. And in order to do that, he had to tell them. And in order for him, these two guys to be able to share that far and wide, it's going to take a lot more people than just two guys. I mean, even if they were two guys as important as the governor, who was Nehemiah, or the high priest, who was Ezra, I mean, two pretty important people in the community, that wasn't going to be enough. So they had people, Nehemiah often talks about, I had these guys were assigned to do this job, and this guy, and you're going to get to hear me do a lot of enunciating of a bunch of words with a bunch of letters in them, a bunch of names with a bunch of letters in them. And I'm just going to tell you right now, by being in this study, you just accept the way that I say them. Right or wrong, you accept that. So the other thing, then when Ezra was there, there's going to be one section where they were reading out of the book of the law, and they were reading it to everybody, and everybody was learning. Okay, so that entire thing was to set up what I want the study to do. We here at Wayne Street have been through a very interesting time over the past 6 months, year almost, where we've been talking about what we want our future to be. Yes, there are certain things that we have changed. That is true. However, there are also some things that we want to preserve. And it's going to take more than Jess and Parker and Don and I to preserve them. It takes all of us. So that's why that's why I got my glasses on tonight, watching that clock back there. When that clock starts to approach 7 o'clock, we're going to break. Hopefully I'll be able to squeeze everything in here tonight. We're going to break. We're going to go upstairs because I want you guys to build relationships with those kids that are upstairs. A lot of those kids have no connection to Wayne Street whatsoever. They show up on Wednesday night, and it's the only time we see them. And we want them to be able to be connected to something valuable, and the most valuable resource I have is you. And so we're going to go out and do that. We're going to take 15 minutes. I promise most of you will probably survive. I mean, the ones you don't, we'll read out the weak ones the first week. But it's just going to be a chance. And I'm not looking for anything theological. I don't want you to go up there and say, yeah, we're going to talk about transubstantiation. No, that's not what we're doing tonight. All I want you to do is go up and ask one question. How's school going? That's it. That's all I want. I want them to talk to you. And I want you to listen to them. Okay, that's it. Can y'all handle that? To my couple of you. All right. Very important because a lot of those kids, like I said, don't have any connection to this church at all. And that's what we want to start to foster. That's the purpose of Parker's little devotion and a few of the other things we're going to do. So, all right, with that all being said, I now have, 47 minutes to walk you through about 6,000 years of history. So we're going to see how well I do with that. First book of the Bible is, are you sure? What is it? Genesis, that's right. Now, in Genesis, you're going to find what I'm going to refer to as prehistory. The pivotal event of the Old Testament, the most important thing that happened in the Old Testament, is the story of the Exodus. The main character of the Exodus is who? Moses. And Moses is such a pivotal character that Moses was still even important in New Testament times. When you read the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is often portrayed as the new Moses. That's how important of a character he was. So everything was recorded prior to that, leading up to the Exodus, and then the Exodus on, and we'll talk about some of the history in there. Not all of, but many of the most fantastic stories of the Old Testament you find in the first parts of Genesis. That's where you read about people who lived 900 years. That's where you're going to read about all the crazy things that happen. The Nephilim, who are the fathers are angels and moms are humans, and they're mating together. And the flood happens in the first half of Genesis, and all these different things. So, kind of the story of prehistory begins with Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God, the most important line in the entire Bible, and then he goes through creation, and everything looks good. Adam and Eve are there. Everything's going well for almost a day. And then what shows up? A snake. And the snake comes along, and what does the snake do? Ask a single question. Eve says, yeah, God said everything here is pretty cool. We can eat whatever of it except for that. And the serpent goes, oh, did he really say that? And then that question has led to every problem we face in our world today. Because most of the destruction and mayhem that we deal with on a daily basis that are caused by our own rebellion against God's plan have all come from that question that Satan puts on our head all the time. Did God really say, did he really mean that? Did he really say respect your parents? Did he really say all these things? And we all know from experience that, yes, God did say those things. And we do a lot better off when we follow them. So we had the serpent show up. The world kind of went into a tailspin. Things were kind of falling apart, not going well. And things continued to descend out of control. That's where we had the angels. Well, actually, the next thing that happens is they have children. That went exceedingly well until one killed the other. And so that's how long that lasted. And a lot of problems with there. Cain was banished and so on and so forth. The world continues to tailspin out of control until we come up till God said, I wish I hadn't even done this. Things are so out of control. So God had a plan, and that plan was flood. So he finds the one righteous guy, and that righteous guy was Noah. And he says, I want you to build a great big boat in the middle of the desert, which is generally not where you build those kind of things. So Noah gets everything together. He starts building. The animals come to him. They get on the boat. God shuts them in. And I know I pointed this out before, but one of the most interesting things about the ark is that God was very specific. 3 decks, and the decks were this big, and the pins were this big, and the base is this big, and we pitch, and very specific. And in all that specific specifications for the ark, there's one instruction not given. What's missing on the ark? You might know. There is no rudder. There is no way to steer it. All it does is float. There's no motor. There's no rudder. There's no the big wheelie thing that you turn. No sail. None of that. All it does is float, and it goes wherever it goes. So they get all this stuff on the boat. Everything's great. They come around, and then the flood goes away. Noah gets off the boat and plants a vineyard. And what's the first thing he did? Anybody know this one? He gets drunk and does what? Passes out naked on the ground. That's our righteous guy. That's our champion. That's the guy that was left. Awesome. So I wish I was making that part up. I'm not. So he passes out on the ground. One of his sons sees him. Noah finds out he saw him. He gets mad, and things descend from there. A couple of generations later, everything's going well, and then we as humans decide to build something. What do we decide to build? Tower of Babel. Okay? So they get together and say, yeah, I think we'll build this Tower of Babel. Purpose of the Tower of Babel is to say it will keep us together. We're all going to be here. Well, one day they get up, they go to work, and find out something very interesting had happened. What was it? They couldn't understand each other. Okay? So this thing that was supposed to keep us together, the languages were now confused, And people kind of said, well, I understand you, so I guess we'll hang out together. And that's kind of how they paired off. And that's the story, according to the Bible, of how we got different languages. Look, I spent a lot of years in French class because of that, and I'm not happy about it. So that's where we are. I think I've said this before. I've had 3 years in high school and 2 years in college, and basically all I could do is say bad things about your mom. That's all I can remember. But so anyways, but that's where we are. So the languages were scrambled, and everybody was brought together, and everybody who spoke together, that's how they all went. Now, one interesting thing about the story of the Tower of Babel, again, when I told you something was missing from the Ark building, something's also missing from the Tower of Babel story. You know what's missing from that? Nowhere does it say in that story that God was angry. The scrambling of the languages was not intended to be a punishment. I may disagree with that, but I'll tell you, especially in those early chapters, if you read in there, one thing the Old Testament is never afraid to say is that God was mad. Yet here, no mention of anger, no mention of wrath, no mention of punishment. It's almost like this was a designed piece of the plan. So take that. I don't know what you want to interpret that as, but that's what's missing. Okay, so everybody starts to spread out, and as they spread out, they come together in towns. Now, towns were kind of a new thing at this time, because prior to that, the only town that they'd ever come close to building was the one at Babel, and that one didn't last all that long. But towns started to come up, and God went to a specific town called A, spelled A-I, so I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. And so he went to A, and he found one guy. You might remember what that one guy's name was? Name was Abram. Okay? He went to Abram, and what did he say to this one guy? He said, I want you to leave. I want you to go to this place I'm designating for you. Now, up until that point, if you look at other religions in the world at that time, every town kind of had their own god. So for a god to come to somebody and say, I want you to leave, that was a very new idea. Okay, so that was kind of a new thing that this was happening. So Abram says, fine, I'll leave. He goes out for a walk, and he keeps walking and walking, and God makes all the promises. You know, stars of the sky will be like your descendants. All this stuff is going to be great, and you're going to have this great wealth, power, et cetera, et cetera. And Abram was, and who became Abraham when God changed his name, he became the recipient, and this is very important. He became the recipient of the first covenant. God made a promise. The promise is you and your people are going to be just it. I mean, they're going to be big, huge bunches of them. It's going to be awesome. And so Abraham was the recipient of the first covenant. Unfortunately, though, there was a problem with all these descendant stories. Anybody know what the problem was? Pretty obvious problem. If you're going to have descendants, what do you need? Kids. He wasn't having any. So his wife named Sarah said, well, take my handmaiden, and she had a kid, and it was named Ishmael, and that ended up being all kinds of problems. But that's where that came from. Finally, when she was 90-some years old, she gets pregnant. Okay. And then she has a kid named Isaac, and Isaac is then the recipient of the covenant. Interestingly enough, if you read Genesis, we don't actually learn a whole lot about Isaac. All we know about him is that his name means laughy, because Abraham or actually Sarah laughed when they said this was going to happen. So when he finally was born, they called him, his name was Laugh. And so Isaac grew up, and he had two sons. I remember their names. Jacob, Esau. Okay. Esau was the older son. Esau was he was a tough guy, okay, the hunter. You know, he was hairy, and he was manly, and smelled like the outdoors, and he went out and fought bears with his bare hands and all this crazy stuff. So that was the firstborn. The secondborn was named Jacob. Well, we'll just suffice it to say Jacob was not that. And so he was not big, tough, and manly. And so, remember, promise of descendants, that's still ringing in Jacob and Esau's minds, or actually Isaac's mind, because he's Abraham's descendant. So the thing, you're going to have all these people. Esau's thinking, I'm the oldest son. It's supposed to be the oldest son. However, it didn't end up being the older son. It was the younger son, who was Jacob, who ended up being the one that the covenant was passed on to. He was the one with the descendants. So Jacob had 12 sons. And if you remember those 12 sons, they became the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? I'm not going to say them all from memory because I don't know them, but you can look them up and they're in there. But the one son that he had was a very specific son whose name was Joseph. Now, Joseph is famous for something that he wore. Anybody remember what he wore? The amazing Technicolor dream coat, right? The coat of many colors. And he was the one that would go around and tell his brothers that, hey, y'all are going to bow down to me. And believe it or not, his brothers were not into that. Who'd have thunk it? So they decided they're going to put him in his place. They beat him up. They sell him into slavery. So he ends up going to Egypt. Keep that in mind. That's where he ends up. He goes into Egypt. While he's there, he has a lot of adventures and things that happen to him. And but one of the things that Joseph always did is Joseph was successful at everything the guy ever tried. Didn't matter what kind of adversity came his way, he ended up overcoming it. So he was sold into slavery. He ends up in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's kind of a big shot in Egypt. And immediately he was like number one slave, second only to Potiphar. It even says in there that with Joseph in charge, the only thing Potiphar had to worry about was how much I'm going to have for supper. It was the only thing he had to worry about, which, I mean, if you had to worry about only one thing, that's a fun thing, right? But that's how well things went. So he was very successful. He was a great manager. He managed his house so well and just became ridiculously prosperous in things. Unfortunately, Potiphar's wife also noticed Joseph, and that ended up becoming a problem. Joseph then ends up in jail. However, the jailer said, well, I'm going to go ahead and put him in charge of the jail, and everything was running so smoothly. I mean, I don't know how you're successful in jail, but somehow Joseph pulled that off. So he spent a couple of years there. Everything was great. Joseph interpreted dreams for two guys. One of them was a baker, and the other one was, I can't remember what the other guy's job was. Oh, the wine taster guy. Okay, so they were both there. They both had a dream. Joseph said, well, the dream is good. Yeah, your dream means you're going to get out, and your dream means you're going to die. Unfortunately for the second guy, he was right. First guy got out, the second guy didn't. And then the guy who got out, he said, hey, will you tell the king? Will you remind him I'm down here and do something about this? The guy says, sure. As soon as he gets out, he forgets. 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream. And he starts insisting, hey, I want this dream interpreted. I want somebody to tell me what it means. And the guy goes, oh, crap, I forgot about Joseph 2 years ago. So he says, yeah, there's a guy you have in jail here who might be able to help you out with this. So they go down, they get Joseph. Joseph comes up, he interprets the dream. He says, and if you remember what the dream meant? 7 years of great and 7 years of nothing, famine, okay? So what Joseph says is, here's what you need to do. Have everybody bring a fifth of everything, and I'll store it. Have them do that the whole time. And then for the 7 years that things aren't so good, we'll sell that back. Pharaoh said, this seems like a good idea. So for 7 years, he's piling in the grain. And then at year number 8, or the first year of famine, things are falling apart. People start to starve. They come to Joseph, and he starts selling the grain back to them. Now, what happens with this is in the process of doing that, everybody in Egypt ends up giving all of their wealth to Pharaoh. That's what he arranges. He basically fleeces the whole country. So he taxes them, takes their grain away from them, then he sells it back to them, and then Pharaoh ends up with all the monies. And that's going to be a very significant detail for later, so hold that in mind. Now, the famine wasn't just in Egypt. There was also famine back to his other brothers. And they were getting hungry, and they went down, and a whole bunch of fiasco went on. Finally, after a couple of trips down there to buy grain, Joseph says, hey, I know I'm big and powerful and awesome and stuff, but you guys one time threw me in a pit and then sold me as a slave. And they're like, oh my gosh, we're dead. So he goes, no, calm down. He says, God put me here for this moment so that I can preserve the promise, right? Because the covenant is what is important. Him being there allowed God to keep his promise that Abraham's descendants were going to become great, because they were going to starve unless something was done, and Joseph happened to be the one who was going to provide. And he did. So he provided great, but not only did he provide, and keep this in mind because this is very important for later. Not only did he provide for the people of Israel, which would have been the 12 tribes of Israel at that time, the founding fathers, so to speak, but he also arranged for Pharaoh to become ridiculously wealthy. I'm talking like off the charts, very, very wealthy. Okay? Pharaoh has all the power because he had all the food. And so this grew Egypt into an empire. Now it was powerful. So after Joseph's lifetime, when he passed away, the first line of the book of Exodus says, and then a Pharaoh came to power who'd never heard of Joseph. And they looked over and saw these Israelites over here starting to grow in power, and they said, well, we can't have that. So what they did was they drug the Israelites into slavery, which is the Exodus that we know of now. So what they did is they enslaved them and made them work. And if you go, you can see historically, Egyptian stuff was growing like crazy at this time. You know, there was the Sphinx, there was pyramids. And somebody had to build all that stuff, and it very. I don't know this, but it very well could have been the Israelites who were part of the slave labor that did that. So they began to work, and then after 400 years of this, of being enslaved, they survived 400 years of slavery, which is amazing that a people can survive that. But through their descendants and everything. But the one thing they always wanted was they wanted to have the promise restored. God promised our ancestor at this point was Abraham, this particular land, we'd like to go back to it. That's all they wanted. So God finally, after 400 years, he hears their plea, and he sends them a champion, somebody to get them out. And that person's name was Moses. So God rises Moses up. Moses is raised in Pharaoh's household. So again, kind of right under Pharaoh's nose. He has a little problem. He saw a Egyptian slave driver beating an Israelite. He got mad and killed him, and then he had to flee, and so he ends up out in the wilderness, and a lot of things happen. But finally, there was a particular experience that caused Moses to decide to go back, and that experience was, what did he see? The burning bush, burning but not consumed. So he saw the burning bush. God said, hey, I want you to go back to that place you escaped from. You know, those people who want to kill you, I'd like you to go back and tell them to, let their entire economic base go. Moses was like, that seems like a really bad idea. And but God says, no, I'm pretty sure that's what we're going to do. And in one of the greatest call stories that's ever been written, Moses goes through every excuse you could ever think of. He says, they want to kill me. I don't think going back's a good idea. He goes through, I don't know how to talk. I forgot how to talk. I can't talk anymore. He's like, well, we'll send your brother with you and it'll be fine. But that doesn't convince him. Finally, after like an entire chapter of Moses going, he finally says, I don't want to go. God's like, I know, and I don't care. So Moses ends up going back through the series of 10 plagues or 10 proofs that God is who he claims to be. And if you go back and read them, we're not going to go through them tonight. If you go back and read them, every single proof is about God punching Pharaoh, especially the last one. Because what's the last miracle? They're running out. The parting of the Red Sea, right? The route escapes. So they run across Pharaoh, who says, "Has anybody ever seen anything like this before?" They decide to go across. Israelites make it fine. Didn't even get dirty on the way over, and then the Egyptians were just washed away. It was all about punching Pharaoh. So in one day, all this wealth that, remember, had been provided by an Israelite, because it was Joseph that got it for him, was taken away in one day. He lost all of his slaves. He lost all of his army. He lost his life. Egypt was really put down that day. The Israelites went from slavery to extreme triumph in one day. Okay? After 400 years of waiting for it, but once God decided to move, it didn't take long for him to get him out. That story to our Jewish sisters and brothers, that is the story. All right, that is the high moment of their faith. I mean, that story to our Jewish sisters and brothers is like the resurrection to us. This great moment of deliverance. However, the Israelites had one very significant but very practical problem. They're heading back to the promised land. They were excited because that was what God promised to do, and now God is delivering. However, these guys had never lived in a situation like this before. They'd never lived in towns. They'd never been free to do what they want. They'd never had somebody who wasn't behind them saying, you do this and you do that. And so they had to establish, what does this mean? You know, we've been building bricks for 400 years. What do we do now? Now we have to learn things like agriculture. We have to learn things like hunting, to learn things like house building. We didn't have to do any of that before. If you go back and listen to what they grumbled against Moses, what did they always say? We had plenty to eat there. Sure, it was awful, but at least we weren't hungry because they took care of us. That was the view of the people. And Moses is like, now we're going to take care of ourselves. And the people were like, why? Why are we doing this? That doesn't take long for people to forget. So they go on out there and they have to have a series of rules. What does it mean to live together? What does it mean to live as a people? And that's when you get the most insomnia-curing book of the entire Bible, known as Leviticus. Any of you who've ever had the pleasure? It's 613 laws. Why were there 613? Because it wasn't 614, apparently. But that's how many laws it was going to take to teach people who didn't know how to live in community to live in community. How do you relate to your brother? And again, God was very specific. You know, if you got a bull and it gets out and it kills somebody and you got to do this and that. Before, what happened? If something broke out, the Egyptians just dealt with it. Now they have to do it themselves. And so they needed all these rules and laws and things to help them live together. So you got Leviticus. That's the rules that help us live together. The next book you have is Numbers. Probably the only book maybe worse than Leviticus. Numbers is genealogy. Again, remember, we're tracing the promise back 400 years, or more than 400 years, back to Abraham. They needed somebody to trace to make sure you belonged here. Because if you don't belong here, we got to throw you out. And that's why you have all those long genealogies of names and names. That's why we very rarely ever read from the book of Numbers in church, because there's a bunch of names there. It's like reading the phone book almost to a lot of it. And just not the most exciting thing. But to them, it was very important because every name on that list, it would be like me reading off a list of all your names. You'd all be looking around going, yeah, here's you. Doesn't mean anything to us. It meant a lot to them because that's how you proved you belonged. Okay, so they travel. They have a little trouble getting there. A journey that should have taken a few weeks took them 40 years because Moses was leading and he wasn't going to ask for directions from nobody. So, all right, thank you for laughing at that joke. So they finally get there after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and establishing what it means. Now they're moving into the promised land, and that's where you get the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is about everything they did trying to take this land. And remember, they've been at this for hundreds of years trying to get to this point. But they were coming up on Deuteronomy, and they had this plan of what they were going to do to get in there and get it. And Deuteronomy is a story of how they did it. And so the next book we have is the book of Joshua. Joshua is the guy, he was Moses' successor. He was the next guy to come after Moses. He was the leader. Where Moses was kind of the prophet, Joshua was the get or done guy. I mean, just the lack of a better term. He was the one that said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go in there. We're going to take this land because God said it's ours, and we're going to kill everyone that gets in the way. That's essentially what it did. A lot of the people who say the Bible is a violent book, Joshua is the book they're talking about. Lots and lots of people die in Joshua. So he is the transitional figure who got them into the land. Now, once the land is conquered, and you get like famous stories like the Battle of Jericho where the walls came crashing down and those kind of things happen in Joshua. Once the land is conquered, people are moving in, starting to live there. Now comes the all-important question. The question that happens anytime you get a group of people together, and that is, who gets to be boss? Who gets to be in charge? And if you know your books of the Bible, you know the very next book is the book of Judges. So the very first leaders they had were judges. And what would happen is if I had to dispute with Kelly, what we would do is we would go to much like a judge works today. We would go to the judge. She present her case. I present my case. The judge says, here it is. This is how it is. And we're happy with it, or they cut off our head. That's kind of how it worked. Okay. And so hopefully they're happy with it. Right. But that's how disputes were settled, is men were set up as a judge, and that worked for a while. Unfortunately, like anything that people run, it became corrupt. So we had to move to a new style of leadership. The next style of leadership were prophets. These are people who simply spoke on behalf of God. Samuel was one of the first famous ones, but there are a number of them in the Old Testament, and we see them kind of all the way through. So the prophets came through. They spoke on behalf of God. They set up the religious life, all those kind of things. They commemorated a lot of the Jewish festivals and things that we read about in the Old Testament, things we see in the New Testament. The prophets were helping the people seeing themselves as people of God and helping them learn what that means. However, toward the end of the time of the prophets, the people said, you know what, Prophet Samuel, we'd like to be like other places. And you know what other places get to have? You might know. We want a king. And Samuel immediately says, no, you don't. And they said, yes, we did. And the prophet said, no, you don't. And all this stuff. They went on, and everybody kept fighting. Finally, God said, fine, give him a king. And the first king was Saul. And if you know anything about the Bible, you know Saul did not work out so well. He had some good moments and some bad moments, but he was not especially popular. However, there was a king that came along that came after Saul. You might remember his name? David. And man, we love us some David. David had problems, but we love David. David was a great military leader. He was a great singer, dancer. I mean, we have him doing all kinds of stuff. He would sing. He was charismatic. He was a nomad fighter for a while. He killed one of the Philistines in one of the Bible's great stories, David and Goliath. He ends up actually fighting with the Philistines at one point. I mean, he was like all over the place. Did a lot of things. Everybody loved David. So David was kind of seen as the fulfillment of the original promise. Now today we can debate that. But at the time, David was seen as, okay, we have arrived. The promise made to Abraham, like hundreds of years prior to that, was fulfilled in David. And the time of the dynasty of David, Israel has never since been more powerful than what it was then. It was a world superpower at that time. So that went okay for a while. Things started to fall apart there. Solomon, wise old Solomon, split the baby Solomon, did okay, but Solomon became almost too bright. He's almost too much. Some of the books of the Bible that Solomon wrote as a young man, he wrote Song of Solomon. If you ever read Song of Solomon, that's not surprising in any way. I'll remind you, the guy had 700 wives and 300 concubines. No surprise he'd write a book like that. The second book he wrote then is the book of Proverbs. He wrote Proverbs as an instructional guide. It was actually a textbook, is what Proverbs originally was. And you think about how many children Solomon must have had. That's how he was a father. He had teachers that would teach his kids these Proverbs so they'd learn how to live. Late in his life, he wrote Ecclesiastes, a book I'd recommend to you sometime. Again, we don't read out of it very often because it's mildly depressing, but speaks to a lot of issues that we see. During Solomon's lifetime, the power of the kingship began to crumble. Not completely, but some cracks were in it. It wasn't like it was when David was there. But then in the time of Solomon's son, there was a split. Now, this split in the kingdom of Israel is very important. It's split into the northern half, and the northern half is known as Israel. Israel was led by a man named Rehoboam. You don't need to write his name down, but that was Solomon's son. But the southern half, they decided to rebel. They didn't like the dynasty of what was going on. They disagreed with Solomon. They didn't like him, and they definitely didn't like his son. They split off into what we know today as Judah, and they split off and And so it was Rehoboam in the north, Jeroboam in the south. Man, that really messed you up. I had to obviously read that on my page here. But that's how it went. And it's important to keep that in mind because that's going to play into what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah. So the kingdom split. If this is the kingdom of Israel, it split kind of 2/3 of the north was Israel and just a little bit on the south was Judah. The one thing Judah had going for it, though, is Judah contained a city you may have heard of called Jerusalem. That's in Judah, and that was a very important place. All right, so after a series of weak kings, basically in both the northern and southern kingdoms, an army came through known as the Babylonians. The Babylonians came in and kicked out and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. They came in and conquered it. And books that we read from the Bible that were written about the Babylonians taking over the northern kingdom, Esther was written during that time, and Daniel, the story of Daniel happened during that time. So just some biblical references to things that were going on. In the southern kingdom in Judah, eventually the Babylonians worked their way far enough south. They also took over the nation of Judah. During that time, you'll read like the 12 minor prophets, Haggai and Zechariah and those guys. Most of them were written during that time, which is why none of them are happy. Jeremiah was written during that time, and Lamentations, again, not very happy, as you can see. And they were destroyed and kind of wrecked over. So after a time of about a couple of hundred years, it may not even been that long, the southern kingdom actually came back. Judah eventually, what happened was the Babylonians controlled the entire area while another nation known as Persia came through. The Persians came through, wiped out the Babylonians. And what the Persians found is inside of this kingdom, there were these people who were in exile. And what they kept saying is the same thing they've been saying all the time. We want to go back to our land. We want a representation of David's kingdom. You know, we want a descendant of King David on the throne. And the king of Persia, whose name was King Cyrus, said, "Really? That's all you want? You want to go back to your land and have a one of David's descendants? We could do that." So what he did is he went over and he said, "All right, find me a descendant of David." They pulled out a guy named Zerubbabel. Don't ask me to spell that. But his name was Zerubbabel. So Cyrus came over and said, "You will do everything I tell you to do, and if you don't, I will cut off your head. But if you're willing to play ball here, I'll make you the king. You can control everything. You guys can all have your land back, and from what I've heard, we're going to have peace." So they sent him home back. They got Jerusalem back. They got all the stuff back, and Cyrus was able to give that to him. So if you go read in the Old Testament anything about King Cyrus, the Bible loves them some King Cyrus. In fact, at one point, he's called the Messiah. So, I mean, they really thought highly of the guy because he gave him back. Now, it was all a ruse. He was still in control. But he said, "Look, if I don't have to fight you, if I can give you this little concession and you guys will cooperate, sure, we can work something out." So once they started moving back into the area, what they found is everything that had been left behind 100 years earlier was obviously now in disrepair. And that's where Ezra and Nehemiah come in. So what they said is everything in Jerusalem had fallen apart. And see, remember, when the original time that everybody was drug away, some people were left. So when now the new guys 100 years later start coming back, the guys who were left were like, "Well, this is really ours." People come back and says, "No, it's really ours." Led to a little conflict. But they were able to get around that. And I don't want to say too much about it because we're going to read about a lot of those conflicts in Nehemiah. So what happened is Ezra came back and said, "Well, we need to reestablish the religious life." Nehemiah came back and said, "We need to rebuild the city." So these two guys worked together. So what we're going to find in the midst of this, and this whole thing that happens, is Ezra is going to be, again, rebuilding the religious life. Nehemiah is going to be rebuilding the city. Nehemiah is building the wall around the city because, according to Nehemiah and everybody else, it wasn't a city if it didn't have a wall. That's the only way you could differentiate a city from the country, because it wasn't like they had New York City. It wasn't cities like that. Even St. Mary's would have been a monster town for those times. I've been to Jerusalem. I've seen parts of the wall that Nehemiah built. It ain't that big. I mean, you can stand on the hill and see the entire thing. I mean, it's not a huge area. but parts of the wall are still there. So he began to build the wall, and we'll read about how he did that. Take a breath. I feel like I've been talking a lot here. That's about 700 years of history in half an hour, okay? I didn't expect you to follow all that, but the reason I wanted you to hear all that, first of all, I paid a lot for my seminary degree. I like to use it every so often. But also, that helps put into context what we're going to be reading. There's a lot of history that comes into this. There's a lot of things at play. There's a lot of old feelings, a lot of old attachments, a lot of old practices that are coming back that Ezra and Nehemiah are going to try to bring back, particularly Ezra, but Nehemiah as well. The idea of building a city and the idea of building a faith, for lack of a better term. That's what Ezra's trying to do. This was a very rough time that they're coming into. And the interesting thing was, I told you there were two kingdoms. The southern kingdom of Judah came back approximately 100 years later. Probably wasn't quite that long. Does anybody know how long it took the nation, the northern kingdom? Anybody know when that one came back? The northern kingdom of Israel was reestablished May 14th, 1948. 2,000 years later, it came back. Okay, and if you and any of you who may have been around or remember at that time, people thought, well, that's going to be the end of the world. That's right. That's what a lot of people had convinced themselves. It took that long for them to come back. It was within the lifetime of people who are alive today. So, interesting piece of that. Okay. I have any questions? I promise I am not going to talk the whole time for all of these. We're going to have discussion time, but tonight there was a lot we had to get through. Have you ever thought about how much happened in the Old Testament? It's a thick book, but it didn't. Sometimes we think it all happened at the same time. It didn't. It happened over hundreds of years. And there was a lot of history and a lot of fighting and a lot of time it took to get through a lot of those things. Of the entire history that I just went through, in my very humble opinion, I think the time frame of Ezra and Nehemiah of the entire Old Testament is what close. Actually, I could say this probably the whole Bible, including the New Testament. I think that time frame matches where we live today, probably closer than any other time in the Bible, as far as what was going on in the world, as far as old traditions breaking down, as far as things happening in the world that had never happened before, how to navigate faith in a whole new landscape. You know, what does it mean to build a city? What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to be attached? All those were questions that Ezra and Nehemiah are going to address. A lot of times, as we're talking through some of these things and reading some of the passages and things, you have to remind yourself, I'm not reading the newspaper, I'm reading from the Bible. Because a lot of the questions, a lot of the fighting, a lot of the arguments, a lot of the anger, a lot of the challenges that these characters are going to come up against, go look at your Google homepage and you're going to read a lot of the same conflicts happening today. They look different today. We fight them different today. We relate to them different today, but the issues that they're dealing with are exactly the same today. The world is being redefined, and the people of God need to figure out what it means to be a people of God in this changing time frame. And Ezra's answer is really clear. A lot of the stuff that we think changed didn't, and a lot of the things that we think ought to be different now needs to change. And because some practices he's going to completely change, other things he's going to reestablish. And many of the things that he's going to insist upon, he and Nehemiah both going to insist upon, are going to be, here's what's important. All right, here's something we're going to have to let go. Look, the temple fell down. Until we get a new one built, I can't help you with that. However, when it comes to time to pray, comes time to reading God's word, those things we're going to see them do those things straight out. And to me, that's why I love Nehemiah, but I wanted to teach this study because especially with Wayne Street disaffiliating, kind of this whole mysterious thing that we're stepping into, I really feel like some of the principles that Ezra and Nehemiah talk about, what does it mean to relate to the world and what does it mean to relate to God during times like this? So I'm hoping by giving you a little history and background, when we start really actually looking at the two books next week, we'll be able to see the lessons that they teach, because some of that stuff, almost all of that stuff is timeless and will apply today in ways that may not have ever before. So All right, we got a couple minutes. Thank you all for being here. I hope you guys get that kind of dying cow in a hailstorm look on your face. So I'm not sure I don't know if I bored you to tears or what, but yeah. Tell you what, read chapter 1 of both books next week, Ezra and Nehemiah. Read chapter 1, and if you want to go into chapter 2, let's go. I don't know how far we'll get because I'm going to be very thorough. I will say the second half, I know Nehemiah better than I know Ezra because I've studied it a lot closer. The second half of Nehemiah, we will get through very quickly because a lot of it's some genealogies. I think Ezra's the same way. But the history stuff that's in the first half, that's what we're going to spend a lot of time with. So familiarize yourself. If you have a good study Bible that has a little background history stuff, read that too. But and if you want to do a Google search, yeah. I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. If you want to read the first 2 chapters and any study Bible stuff that you have, anybody who wants to come and ask a good question about that next week or bring something that you want to observe, I might have a bag of prizes next week. I'll bribe you to get you to talk. I don't care. I'm not above that. So I'm not promising the prizes will be anything that you necessarily want, but you get what you get. So now, speaking of preserving and traditions and helping people grow into what that means to be a part of that, that's what we're about to do. Because one of the things that like I've been teaching Bible studies for decades. One of the things about Bible studies that I don't want to say is frustrating because I love studying this stuff and I would do it all the time anyways. But one of the parts of this that I find to be lacking is application. Well, this Bible study is going to have a very clear application because there are kids upstairs who we are counting on to preserve these traditions. If you want, the grandkids and great-grandkids to have what we have today, those kids up there are the ones who are going to have to carry it there, not us. We're responsible for it today, but they're going to be responsible for it tomorrow. And I'm giving you the gift of this opportunity to just build a relationship with them. Help them understand that Wayne Street Church is a place where they belong, because it is. Some of those kids are a little rough around the edges, and like I said, sometimes you just have to roll with what happens. But this is important because we have a lot of kids in this community. Again, not all of them, but a number of them that are here who just need to belong someplace good, and we have a chance to be that. And if we don't do that, we're not being the church. So I'm going to give you a couple, because I don't want to show up early because I'm sure Don's got chaos happening up there. I'll give you a minute to discuss around the table. I tell you what, share around your table. Look at the people at your table. Tell everybody go around, especially you two. Tell everybody one thing that I told you tonight that you didn't know. Go. Whoever's on there with us, thanks for joining us.